If World War III were to break out today, who would be hit first? Where would the first missiles fall, the first tanks roll in, or the first cities fall silent? In a world wide with alliances, rivalries, and nuclear red lines, some countries sit right on the fault lines of global war. This is not just a what-if, it's a look into the geopolitical powder kegs that could ignite a global inferno. Brains stick around as we count down the 10 countries that would likely be hit first in World War III, and why. Number 10. North Korea. Why it's at risk. North Korea's constant missile tests and threats against South Korea, Japan, and even the US make it a prime first strike candidate. Trigger scenario: if North Korea launches a preemptive strike or crosses the DMZ, expect immediate US and South Korean retaliation, possibly within minutes. Key targets: Pyongyang, missile bases, and nuclear facilities. Quote, fact: the US maintains over 28,000 troops in South Korea. Any North Korean aggression is considered a direct attack on America. Number 9. South Korea. Why it's at risk. Seoul lies just 35 miles from the North Korean border, within easy range of artillery and missiles. Trigger scenario: if North Korea attacks or China intervenes in Taiwan, South Korea could be dragged into a multi-front war. Key targets: Seoul, military bases, ports hosting US ships. Quote, fact: any war on the Korean peninsula will be brutal, fast, and potentially nuclear within hours. Number 8. Taiwan. Taiwan is the most likely spark for a global conflict in the 21st century. China sees the island as a breakaway province that must be reunified, by force if necessary. Taiwan, on the other hand, is a thriving democracy of 23 million people, determined to remain free. Why it's at risk. Beijing's military posture has grown increasingly aggressive. Chinese warplanes regularly violate Taiwan's airspace, while warships shadow the island's perimeter. A full-scale invasion, across the 100-mile-wide Taiwan Strait, is no longer unthinkable. It's being rehearsed. If China attacks, the United States is likely to intervene. Japan may join. NATO could be pulled in. What starts as a regional war could explode into a global one, in days. Trigger scenario: a sudden Chinese amphibious assault, beginning with massive missile strikes on Taiwan's military infrastructure. Ports, airfields, and command centers would be hit within the first hours. Chinese troops could land before the world has time to react. Key targets: Taipei, the capital and political heart. Kaohsiung Port, vital for trade and defense. Air bases and radar installations, to blind Taiwan's response. Quote, fact: a conflict over Taiwan would not stay regional, it would go global in days. That's a warning from top US military leaders, and it reflects the scale of risk. Taiwan isn't just a political issue, it's the trigger point where superpowers, ideologies, and military alliances would collide. Number 7. Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has already redrawn the map of Europe, but the worst-case scenario is still on the table. Despite more than 2 years of grinding combat, Ukraine remains the epicenter of a potential global war. Why it's at risk. Ukraine is still locked in a brutal war with Russia. While the front lines fluctuate, the political stakes only rise. As Ukraine pushes for full NATO membership, and as Western weapons flood into the country, Russia views this not as a border dispute, but as a proxy war with the West. The Kremlin has warned repeatedly, a formal NATO presence in Ukraine is a red line. If crossed, it could trigger a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, the world's largest nuclear power. Trigger scenario: imagine this: Ukrainian forces retake more territory in the east. Russia responds by launching long-range strikes deeper into the west, perhaps even toward Lviv, near the Polish border. A missile crosses into NATO territory. Article 5 is triggered. Suddenly, this is no longer Ukraine's war, it's everyone's. Alternatively, if Ukraine formally joins NATO, even under limited protection, Russian retaliation could be immediate and catastrophic. Key targets: Western Ukraine, especially Lviv, a vital logistics hub for NATO aid. Supply corridors from Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, lifelines for Ukraine's war effort. Railroads, fuel depots, and power stations, to paralyze resistance and disrupt NATO response. Quote, fact: the next phase of the Ukraine war could involve NATO jets in the skies and boots on the ground. That chilling assessment comes from defense analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. Why it matters: if NATO forces enter the conflict directly, even in a limited capacity, the risk of escalation is massive. Russian and NATO forces have not fought directly since World War II, but Ukraine could change that overnight. This is more than a war over borders. It's a battle over the post-Cold War order, and a flashpoint that could drag Europe, and possibly the entire world, into World War III. Number 6. Poland. Poland may not be the center of a war yet, but if World War III breaks out, it won't stay on the sidelines for long. As NATO's most critical eastern bulwark, Poland sits on a knife's edge, caught between alliance obligations, geographic vulnerability, and the growing firestorm to the east. Why it's at risk? Poland has become NATO's logistical heart for the war in Ukraine. Every shipment of weapons, ammunition, medical aid, and fuel flowing to the Ukrainian front lines likely passes through Polish soil, especially through the city of Rzeszów, now known as the nerve center of NATO support. But Poland is also bordered by Belarus, a close Russian ally, and lies uncomfortably close to Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian exclave packed with advanced missiles, radar systems, and nuclear-capable Iskander launchers. If Russia ever decides to cut off NATO's support lifeline to Ukraine, or sees Poland as a staging ground for a NATO counteroffensive, this country would be one of the first to face a direct assault. Imagine this: Russia accuses NATO of using Polish bases to strike targets in Crimea or Donbas. In retaliation, it launches a wave of precision missile strikes on Rzeszów's airport, disrupting the alliance's lifeline to Ukraine. Simultaneously, Russian and Belarusian forces conduct military exercises near the Polish border that suddenly turn real. Or worse, if NATO decides to deploy a rapid reaction force into Ukraine to deter a Russian escalation, the assembly point is almost certainly Poland. That makes it target number one for Russian preemptive strikes. This isn't fantasy. It's war gaming that's already being run in defense ministries around the world. Key targets: Rzeszów, Poland's critical NATO air and logistics hub, already operating at wartime tempo. Warsaw, the capital, a symbol of NATO's eastern resolve and a communications powerhouse. Airbases and radar stations, especially near Lublin and Białystok, that provide real-time surveillance and air superiority. The Suwałki Gap, a narrow corridor between Poland and Lithuania, flanked by Kaliningrad and Belarus, a potential choke point for NATO reinforcement. Poland has quietly become NATO's war room for Eastern Europe. This statement, echoed by US generals and European defense officials alike, highlights how crucial Poland has become in the broader NATO strategy. Behind closed doors, it's understood: if Poland falls, or even stumbles, the entire eastern flank of NATO begins to unravel. Why it matters: Poland is not just a member of NATO. It's the first responder, the logistics lifeline, and potentially the frontline battlefield. A Russian missile strike on Polish soil wouldn't just be a tragedy, it would trigger Article 5, activating NATO's collective defense mechanism. That's the line between regional war and full-scale global conflict. And that line runs right through Poland. Number 5. The Baltic States. The Baltic States, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are small in size but huge in strategic importance. All three share borders with Russia or its ally Belarus. And all three are members of NATO. That makes them a perfect test case for Moscow. If Russia ever wanted to challenge the West without launching a full-blown assault on a major power, the Baltics would be a tempting target. Why they're at risk? Russia has long viewed the Baltic region as part of its sphere of influence. In fact, NATO military planners believe these countries could be overrun by Russian forces in under 60 hours if not heavily reinforced. This isn't just speculation. Russia has staged massive military exercises near their borders. Kaliningrad, the heavily armed Russian enclave nestled between Poland and Lithuania, adds even more pressure. Trigger scenario: a sudden incident in eastern Latvia or Estonia, perhaps a false flag involving Russian-speaking minorities, sparks a Russian peacekeeping mission. Tanks roll in under the pretense of protection, mimicking the 2014 Crimea scenario. The world watches, and waits to see if NATO will respond. Key targets: Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius, the capitals and political nerve centers. Railways and communication hubs, to sever Western coordination. NATO forward bases, small but critical units in each Baltic state that act as a tripwire. Quote, fact: a Russian move here would force NATO's Article 5 into action, no turning back. That's the nightmare. If Russia invades, NATO must respond. There's no delay, no diplomacy, just war. The Baltic states may be small, but a war here would ignite the largest military alliance in history. And once that domino falls, World War III wouldn't just be likely, it would be underway. Number 4. Israel. Israel has been living in a state of near constant tension since its founding, but in 2025, it stands closer to the brink of a regional war that could spiral into global conflict than ever before. Surrounded by hostile non-state actors and regional adversaries, and with Iran's nuclear ambitions reaching dangerous levels, Israel sits on a geopolitical powder keg. The question is no longer if conflict will erupt, but when. Why it's at risk. Israel's major existential threat comes from Iran, a nation whose leadership has repeatedly declared its desire to eliminate the Israeli state. Iran is expanding its influence via proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militias in Syria and Iraq. It has also accelerated uranium enrichment, inching closer to developing a nuclear weapon. Israel has made it clear, it will never allow Iran to become a nuclear power. At the same time, internal tensions remain high, between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and with the broader Arab world, despite recent normalization efforts. In this environment, even a small spark could ignite a full-blown regional inferno. Trigger scenario: imagine this, Israeli intelligence confirms Iran is within weeks of completing a nuclear warhead. Rather than wait, Israel launches a surprise preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities using F-35 jets and bunker-busting munitions. Iran retaliates hard. Hundreds of missiles are launched at Israeli cities from Iran, Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza. The Iron Dome and David Sling air defense systems are overwhelmed. In response, the US, a close ally of Israel, activates regional forces. Meanwhile, Hezbollah opens a northern front, and the Houthis block shipping lanes in the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are pulled in. Oil markets collapse. The war expands beyond borders. Key targets: Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, population centers and political command. Military airbases and command posts, especially those in the Negev desert. Dimona nuclear research facility, a potential high-value target for Iran. Haifa and Eilat ports, to cripple trade and logistics. Quote, fact, Israel has already warned it will not wait for Iran to go nuclear, it will act. This isn't just rhetoric. Israeli defense planners are openly preparing for a multi-front war involving Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza, and possibly with US and NATO involvement. And if nuclear weapons enter the equation, world powers won't have the luxury of staying on the sidelines. Number 3. Iran. Iran stands at the very heart of Middle Eastern volatility, and if World War III breaks out, it's one of the most likely starting points. For decades, Iran has walked a tightrope between confrontation and containment. But in recent years, its nuclear ambitions, proxy network, and tense standoff with both Israel and the United States have made it a live wire in global geopolitics. Why it's at risk? Iran's role in the region is both strategic and destabilizing. It's the chief sponsor of armed groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. These proxies give Iran a long reach across the Middle East, and a network through which it can strike US allies without launching a conventional war. But the biggest flashpoint remains Iran's nuclear program. Despite global sanctions and sabotage efforts, Iran has resumed uranium enrichment at levels closer than ever to weapons grade. It insists the program is peaceful, but most Western intelligence agencies disagree. That's where the danger lies. For Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran is an unacceptable threat. And for the US, Iran's ability to choke off the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow sea lane through which 20% of the world's oil passes, makes it a global security concern. Trigger scenario: picture this, after months of rising tensions, Israeli intelligence confirms Iran is on the verge of building a nuclear weapon. In coordination with the US, Israel launches a preemptive strike on nuclear enrichment sites in Natanz, Fordow, and Iraq. Iran retaliates with a barrage of missiles targeting Israeli and US military assets in the region. The US responds with airstrikes on Iranian missile factories, airbases, and command centers. Iran then moves to close the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting global oil trade. Oil prices skyrocket. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations are dragged in. Hezbollah opens a front in Lebanon. US Navy fleets mobilize across the Gulf. Russia and China condemn US action, and tensions spread far beyond the Middle East. Key targets: Natanz and Fordow nuclear facilities, Iran's most fortified enrichment centers. Tehran, political and military command nodes. Revolutionary Guard bases, especially those linked to missile operations. Strait of Hormuz naval assets, crucial for oil export and global shipping. Esfahan and Mashhad, strategic industrial and air defense zones. Quote, fact, the US has long had strike plans for Iran's nuclear program, just waiting for a political green light. In fact, these plans have been rehearsed for years. US war games and Air Force drills have consistently included scenarios targeting hardened nuclear sites deep underground. The military option has never left the table. If war begins with Iran, it won't stay regional for long. A strike on Iran would ripple across the globe, impacting oil markets, military alliances, and nuclear diplomacy. And if Iran lashes out with everything it has, through proxies, cyber attacks, and missile strikes, countries far from the Middle East could feel the consequences. Number 2. Japan. In any potential World War III scenario involving Asia, Japan is not just close to the action, it's right in the blast zone. With over 50,000 US troops stationed on its soil, Japan is America's most significant military ally in the Indo-Pacific region. Strategically located just northeast of Taiwan and sharing tense waters with both China and North Korea, Japan sits in one of the most volatile geopolitical hotspots on Earth. Why it's at risk? Japan's security is directly tied to US interests in the region. Under the US-Japan Security Treaty, any attack on US forces or Japanese territory obliges a joint military response. And with China's aggressive posturing toward Taiwan, Japan's islands, especially Okinawa, would likely be among the first targets if conflict breaks out. But that's not all. Japan has its own disputes with China, especially over the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited rocks in the East China Sea that both countries claim. Chinese Coast Guard vessels frequently patrol near them, increasing tension and the potential for accidental conflict. Add to that the North Korean wildcard, with its unpredictable missile launches and nuclear threats, and Japan finds itself surrounded by storm clouds from every direction. Trigger scenario: let's say China begins a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. The US moves to defend the island, and its bases in Okinawa and Yokosuka become crucial staging areas. China, seeing those bases as threats, launches preemptive strikes on US and Japanese assets in southern Japan. Japan responds with its self-defense forces, scrambling jets and deploying missile defenses. In retaliation, Chinese ballistic missiles target key ports, airbases, and communication hubs across the Japanese archipelago. Meanwhile, North Korea seizes the moment, launching missile tests, or worse, over Japan to distract and destabilize. What begins as a regional war over Taiwan quickly expands to involve Japan directly, dragging in NATO allies, and potentially escalating into a wider Pacific conflict. Key targets: Okinawa, home to major US air and naval bases, and within range of Chinese missile systems. Tokyo and Yokosuka, the political and naval command centers of Japan. Naval ports like Sasebo and Kure, essential for deployment and resupply. Japanese radar and missile defense installations, especially on outer islands. Logistics corridors and power plants, key for sustaining military operations. Quote, fact, if Taiwan falls, Japan becomes the next frontline. This isn't just speculation. Japanese officials have said it outright. In 2021, Japan's Deputy Prime Minister declared that Taiwan's defense is directly linked to Japan's survival. And in 2023, Japan began massively increasing its defense budget for the first time in decades. Japan may be a pacifist nation by constitution, but its location, alliances, and proximity to China ensure that if World War III breaks out in Asia, it won't be watching from the sidelines. It will be on the front lines, whether it wants to be or not. Number 1. United States. Why it's at risk. As the central pillar of NATO and the Pacific Alliance, the US will be involved in any large-scale conflict from day one. Trigger scenario: China or Russia may attempt a limited strike on US bases abroad, or, in a worst-case scenario, a direct homeland attack. Key targets: Guam, Hawaii, US bases in Europe and Asia, cyber infrastructure, possibly major coastal cities. Quote, fact, the idea of war not reaching American soil is outdated. Modern missile ranges, cyber warfare, and space weapons have erased those borders. War doesn't wait for diplomacy. And in today's world, the first strikes could happen without warning, on multiple fronts, with devastating speed. This list isn't about fear, it's about understanding how fragile peace can be when great powers collide. Eyes, now we want to hear from you. Which country do you think is the most at risk in a future global war? Let us know in the comments below. Thumbs up, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into global conflicts, strategy, and the forces shaping our future.